stop what you are doing and listen to the silence for a second, because inside that silence lies a terrifying truth about the machine you trust with your life every single day. And I need you to ask yourself a question that might haunt you the next time you turn your key in the ignition. Have you ever wondered why everything in this universe decays and rots and dies, except for one specific anomaly that seems to defy the laws of physics and entropy itself? I am talking about the engine of a Honda, and before you click away thinking this is just a car story, I need you to understand that this is not a story about cars. This is a story about a psychological obsession so deep and so dangerous that it bordered on madness. A secret buried in the blueprints of the 1940s that proves the vehicle in your garage was never actually designed to drive on the road. It was designed to survive the sky. And if you think that sounds crazy, consider the fact that while other manufacturers were building engines to last a warranty period, one man was building engines to prevent a pilot from falling out of the clouds and dying, and that man was Soichiro Honda. But to understand the secret, we have to break into the archive of his mind and look at the trauma that created the legend, because reliability is not a feature, it is a response to the fear of death and failure, and Soichiro was a man chased by demons his entire life. Imagine a world where a single millimeter of error doesn't just mean a broken part, it means a fiery explosion and a funeral. That was the standard Soichiro lived by, not because he was a car manufacturer, but because his soul was trapped in the cockpit of an airplane long before he ever built a Civic or an Accord. And this is the hook that catches your brain right now. The reason your old Honda refuses to die, even when you abuse it, even when you forget to change the oil, is because hidden deep inside its DNA is the genetic code of an aircraft engine, and the company has been hiding the true extent of this origin story for decades to keep the competition from understanding why they can never replicate it. The story begins not with success, but with a humiliation so profound it would have shattered a weaker man. Let's travel back to 1937 in Japan, a time of tension and industry, where a young uneducated mechanic named Soichiro Honda poured his blood and sweat into creating piston rings for Toyota. And I want you to feel the crushing weight of that moment when he presented his work to the Toyota engineers, men with degrees and clean suits, who looked at his creations with disgust and told him they were garbage. Out of 50,000 rings he made, only 3 passed the quality control standards of Toyota. And just imagine the psychological damage of that rejection. Standing there covered in grease and shame, realizing that your best effort was considered trash by the establishment. But here is where the psychological twist happens. Most people would quit, most people would accept they are not good enough, but Soichiro did not see failure. He saw a gap in his knowledge that needed to be filled with something more potent than engineering. He realized that car standards were too low, even Toyota's standards were too low for what he envisioned. He didn't want to build parts that were just good enough for a car. He wanted to build parts that had the precision of the aviation industry, which he idolized. He sold his wife's jewelry just to stay afloat, he slept in the workshop, he became a ghost haunting his own factory, obsessed with the metallurgy of piston rings because he knew that if he could master the seal of a piston, he could master the explosion itself. And this brings us to the most disturbing realization about the Honda engine. It is not built with love, it is built with paranoia, the paranoia that if a part fails, the creator has failed his duty to existence itself. Soichiro went back to school not to get a degree, but to harass the professors to extract the secrets of metal composition like a spy stealing state secrets. He didn't care about the diploma, he cared about the silence of a perfectly running machine. And when he finally returned to Toyota with his new piston rings, they weren't just acceptable, they were perfect. They were over-engineered to a level that made no financial sense. And that is the key phrase you need to lock into your memory. No financial sense. Because the secret to Honda's eternal life is that, for the first 30 years of the company, they operated on a philosophy that lost them money on every single unit in terms of time spent just to ensure that the machine was immortal, because Soichiro treated every engine like it was holding his own heart pumping inside the aluminum block. And as we peel back the layers of history, we find that during the war, the manufacturing plants didn't just make car parts, they made aircraft parts, specifically metal propellers for bombers and fighters. And this is the smoking gun, the critical link that explains everything. The machinery, the calibration tools, the very mindset of the workers was shifted from automotive tolerances, which are loose and forgiving, to aerospace tolerances, where a fraction of a hair's width difference means catastrophe. So when the war ended and the smoke cleared and Japan was in ruins, Soichiro Honda looked at the wasteland and decided to put an engine on a bicycle. But he didn't use a bicycle engine mentality. He used the ghost of the aviation industry. The bearings, the alloys, the compression ratios, they were all echoes of the sky. And that brings us to the terrifying reality of what you are driving. You are not driving a car. You are piloting a grounded aircraft that has been shackled to the road. And in the next part of this story, we are going to open up the engine block and look at the specific components that prove this theory, the parts that engineers say should have broken 50 years ago but are still spinning today, because of a decision made by a man who screamed at his workers and hit them with wrenches if they missed a measurement by a micron, because he wasn't building for the customer. He was building for the gods of mechanics. And the story is only going to get darker and more complex from here, because we haven't even touched on the VTEC Conspiracy or the reason why Formula One banned their technology. But first you need to understand the metal itself. You are looking at a block of aluminum, but I need you to see it as a frozen liquid that was forced into shape under pressure so intense it mimics the conditions of the deep ocean, because the second secret to the Honda engine's immortality lies in a process called high-pressure die casting, which Soichiro borrowed directly from the manufacturing of aircraft fuselages. And while American car companies were pouring molten iron into sand molds like they were baking cakes in a primitive oven, Honda was injecting aluminum alloys into steel dies with the violence of a gunshot. And this matters because sand casting leaves microscopic air bubbles inside the metal, little pockets of weakness waiting to crack 10 years down the line. But the Honda method expelled every molecule of air, creating a density so high that the metal acts less like a car part and more like a single solid diamond. And this obsession with air brings us to the most controversial chapter in the company's history, a chapter that almost destroyed them, because Soichiro Honda had a mental breakdown over the concept of water cooling. He believed, with a religious fanaticism, that engines should be air-cooled, just like the Zero fighter planes he admired. He would scream at his engineers, asking them why they wanted to add water to an engine when the air around us is free and infinite. And this wasn't just a quirky preference, it was a philosophy of survival, because in the sky, if your radiator leaks, you die. So he forced the company to build the Honda 1300, a car that was technically a road vehicle but mechanically a monstrosity of aviation engineering. It had a dry sump oil system, which is something you only find in race cars and airplanes, and it cooled itself by funneling air through complex ducts that looked like the inside of a jet turbine. And although the car failed commercially, it proved that the company was willing to bankrupt itself to uphold a standard of engineering that nobody asked for. But the world finally woke up to this secret in the 1970s during the Great Emissions Crisis, when the US government passed the Clean Air Act, and giants like General Motors and Ford threw up their hands and said it was physically impossible to build an engine that clean without expensive, heavy catalytic converters. They literally told Congress the technology did not exist. But back in Japan, the Honda engineers looked at the problem not as car mechanics but as chemists, and they created the CVCC engine, which used a pre-chamber combustion method, a technique that controls the explosion in stages, essentially slowing down time inside the cylinder to burn the fuel so completely that nothing toxic was left behind. And when they shipped a Honda Civic to the United States, General Motors bought one, took it apart, and the CEO of GM couldn't believe his eyes, because this tiny Japanese company had solved a physics problem that the unlimited budget of Detroit couldn't crack. And this is the moment the infinite life legend was solidified, because the tolerances inside that engine were so tight that the oil didn't degrade, the metal didn't warp, and the engine simply forgot to age. But now we have to turn the page to the tragic part of the story, the part where the decay begins, because you asked why new Hondas aren't the same, and the answer is heartbreakingly simple. The magicians died and the accountants took over. You see, for decades there was an internal document at Honda known as the 00 standard, a mythical list of quality requirements that Soichiro himself wrote, and it stated that a part must be designed to withstand 3 times its maximum expected load, essentially a 300% safety margin, which is unheard of in the automotive industry, where 10% is considered generous. But when Soichiro retired and eventually passed away, the new executives looked at the A00 standard and saw only lost profits. They saw over-engineering where he saw integrity, and slowly, year by year, the safety margins were shaved down from 300% to 200% to 150%. And while modern Hondas are still good, they are no longer immortal, because they are designed by computer algorithms that calculate the exact moment a warranty expires, whereas the old engines were designed by a man who was terrified of God. And this brings us to the most chilling realization of all. If you drive a Honda from the 90s or early 2000s, you are driving the last echoes of that original fear. You are driving a machine built by a cult of engineering that has been disbanded, and the factory workers who knew the secret of the hand finish are gone. replaced by robots that feel nothing but do not think. The story ends here because there is one final piece of the puzzle, a specific component inside the transmission that was banned from professional racing because it gave an unfair advantage, and it connects directly to a clandestine meeting Soichiro had with Ayrton Senna, the Formula One legend, where he revealed the ultimate purpose of his machines. And to understand that, we have to look at the blood spilled on the track. We are now entering the danger zone of this story, the moment where mechanical engineering crossed the line into biological warfare on the racetrack, because to understand why your Honda Civic feels the way it does, you have to look at the bloodshot eyes of Ayrton Senna in 1988, when he realized that Honda had given him a weapon that could manipulate time itself. The relationship between Soichiro Honda and Ayrton Senna was not a sponsorship deal. It was a spiritual pact between two men who were trying to escape the limitations of the human body and the physics of the earth. Soichiro saw in Senna the perfect pilot for his aviation obsession, and Senna saw in the Honda engine a heart that beat in perfect synchronization with his own adrenaline. But the secret weapon wasn't just horsepower, it was a technology that the rest of the world called VTEC. But inside the Honda research facility, it was known as the Jekyll and Hyde protocol because before this invention, an engine had to choose a personality. It could either be efficient and weak or powerful and thirsty. There was no middle ground. It was a law of physics that nobody dared to challenge, until a Honda engineer named Ikuo Kajitani locked himself in a room and decided to break the rules of thermodynamics. He created a camshaft that could physically shapeshift while spinning at 6,000 revolutions per minute. Imagine a lung that can instantly double its size the moment you need to sprint. That is what VTC is. It is a mechanical schizophrenia that allows a grocery getter to turn into a race car in a fraction of a second. And when they unveiled this technology, the Western automotive giants laughed because they thought it was too complex to be reliable. They said the locking pins would shatter, they said the oil pressure would fail, but they forgot the first rule of this story. Honda builds to aviation standards. And not only did it work so well that it created a cult of followers who would drive their cars to the red line every single day just to feel that crossover point, where the engine note changes from a hum to a scream. But the true terror for the competition came on the Formula One track, where the Honda engines were so dominant that they were winning 15 out of 16 races in a single season. A statistic that is statistically impossible in a sport with that much variance. And rumors started flying in the pit lanes that Honda was using illegal telemetry, that they had found a way to change the engine mapping wirelessly from the pits, which was strictly forbidden. But the truth was far scarier. They weren't cheating, they just had better metallurgy. The blocks could withstand turbo boost pressures that would turn a Ferrari engine into a Grenade. And amidst this dominance, there is a specific story about the Honda NSX that reveals the final secret of the old Honda quality control. Ayrton Senna was invited to test the prototype of the NSX at the Suzuka circuit, a car that the engineers had spent years perfecting. They thought it was flawless, they thought it was the pinnacle of Japanese engineering. Senna drove it for 2 laps, came into the pits wearing loafers and casual clothes, looked the head engineer in the eye and said, "I am not sure if I can really drive this car. It feels a little fragile." And that single sentence sent a shockwave of panic through the entire corporation, because the god of driving had just called their masterpiece fragile. So what did they do? They didn't just tune the suspension, they went back to the drawing board and increased the chassis rigidity by 50%, creating a frame so stiff it felt like a single piece of granite. And that is why, if you find an original NSX today, it feels tighter than a modern car, because it was calibrated by the nervous system of the greatest driver who ever lived. But tragically, this era of perfection was destined to end, because on August 5, 1991, the heart of the company stopped beating. Soichiro Honda passed away, and the timing was so poetic it feels scripted, because he died right before the Japanese Grand Prix. And when the Honda-powered McLaren crossed the finish line to win the championship that year, Senna didn't just point to the sky, he was signaling to the ghost of the man who built the engine behind his head. And with Soichiro gone, the paranoid protection over the engineering standards began to fade. The accountants started looking at the double wishbone suspension, which is complex and expensive, and they asked, "Do we really need this for a family sedan?" And slowly, the aviation DNA began to unravel into corporate cost-cutting. Which brings us to the next chapter of this nightmare, where we have to talk about the automatic transmissions of the early 2000s, the glass gearboxes that shattered the reputation of the brand, and the dark secret of why the company forgot how to build the one part that connects the power to the wheels. You are sitting in your car at a traffic light, and the light turns green, and you press the gas pedal. But nothing happens except for the sound of an engine revving into the void. And in that moment of panic, you are experiencing the physical manifestation of a corporate betrayal that cost Honda billions of dollars and destroyed the trust of a generation. Because we have arrived at the era of the glass gearbox. A dark period in the early 2000s where the ghost of Soichiro Honda had finally left the building and the accountants were running the asylum. Specifically regarding the 5-speed automatic transmissions found in the Odyssey, the Accord, and the Acura TL. And the tragedy here is not just that the parts broke. It is why they broke. You see, for decades Honda refused to use planetary gears in their automatic transmissions like every other manufacturer, because Soichiro thought they were lazy engineering. So they built automatics that worked like manuals with sliding gears, a complex, beautiful watch-like mechanism. But when the V6 engines got more powerful in the late 90s, the transmission casing simply couldn't handle the heat and the torque, and instead of redesigning the entire system to be stronger, the new management decided to just software patch it and hope for the best. They literally tried to fix a hardware problem with code, and the result was catastrophic. Internal clutch packs would overheat and shatter, sending shards of metal circulating through the transmission fluid like shrapnel, effectively murdering the gearbox from the inside out. And thousands of families found themselves stranded on highways not because of bad luck, but because a spreadsheet somewhere said that a proper redesign was too expensive. And this philosophy of good enough started spreading like a virus to other parts of the car. The most painful example for the purists was the death of the double wishbone suspension, which was the secret sauce that made a humble Civic handle like a Porsche for 30 years. It was a suspension system derived from Formula One, but it was expensive to manufacture and it took up space. So in 2001, with the release of the 7th generation Civic, Honda killed it. They replaced it with McPherson struts, which is the cheap, generic suspension setup that every other economy car uses. And the moment they did that, the magic was gone. The car no longer danced on the road, it just drove. And while the average consumer didn't notice the difference, the die-hard fans felt it immediately. They felt the soul leaving the machine. And this was the era where Toyota started to overtake them, not in performance but in perceived quality. Because while Honda was fighting lawsuits over broken transmissions, Toyota was building boring, unbreakable appliances. And Honda was having an identity crisis, trying to be everything to everyone, and failing to be the one thing they used to be, which was special. But even in this darkness, there was one final flicker of the old brilliance, a last stand of the true engineers, and it came in the form of the K-Series engine. If you know anything about cars, you know that the K20 and K24 are considered the last true masterpieces of the internal combustion engine before the world went fully digital. These engines were overbuilt, capable of handling double their factory horsepower with stock internals, just like the old days. It was as if a rogue team of engineers smuggled the old blueprints past the accountants one last time, creating an engine that is now legendary in the tuning community. But it was a heart of gold trapped in a body of plastic. Because while the engine was immortal, the car around it was getting cheaper. The interior plastics became hard and scratchy. The paint quality dropped, leading to the infamous clear coat peeling, where Hondas would look like they had a skin disease after 5 years in the sun. And this visual decay was a symbol of the internal rot. The company was no longer afraid of failure. They had become arrogant, resting on the laurels of the reputation Soichiro built. And they didn't realize that reputation is a non-renewable resource, and they were burning through it at record speed. But the story gets even more complicated because just as they were losing their way, the world changed again. The era of the turbo arrived, and the government regulations tightened around their necks, forcing them to make a decision that would fundamentally change the DNA of the brand forever. They had to abandon natural aspiration, the very thing that made VTEC magical. And in the next part, we are going to look at the modern era, the 1.5 turbo oil dilution scandal, and the question that every mechanic is asking today: is the new Honda actually a Honda? Or is it just another disposable appliance with a famous badge on the grille? We have arrived at the final chapter of this saga, and the conclusion is not going to be what you expect. Because if you think this story ends with a happy ending, where Honda returns to its glory days, you haven't been paying attention to how the world works. The modern era of Honda is defined by a single controversial engine, the 1.5-liter turbo, specifically the L15B7. And this piece of machinery represents the final death of the aviation standard we talked about in the beginning, because for the first time in history Honda engines started destroying themselves not because of abuse, but because of design. You see, in their desperate attempt to meet impossible fuel economy regulations and compete with the torque of German cars, they adopted direct injection and turbocharging, but they made a fatal miscalculation known as oil dilution, where unburned gasoline is forced past the piston rings and mixes with the engine oil, effectively turning the lubricant into a thin, watery solvent that eats the bearings alive. And just think about the irony of that for a second. The company that was founded by a man who obsessed over the perfect seal of a piston ring is now selling millions of cars where the rings fail to seal by design. It is the ultimate betrayal of the founder's ghost. And yet, this isn't where the story ends. It is where it transcends. Because while the car division has become just another manufacturer fighting for survival in a sea of generic appliances, the soul of Soichiro Honda didn't die, it just migrated. You have to stop looking at the road and start looking at the sky. Because in 2015, long after Soichiro was buried, the company finally achieved his ultimate impossible dream. They certified the Honda Jet. And if you look at that plane, you will see the engineering madness is still alive. The engines are mounted on top of the wings, which is something aviation experts said was stupid and impossible, but Honda did it anyway, and it increased efficiency by 20%, proving that the spirit of doing the impossible still exists. It just doesn't exist in your Civic anymore. It exists in a $5 million aircraft. And this leaves us with the heavy realization about the machine sitting in your driveway right now. If you own an old Honda from the golden era, from the 90s or the early 2000s, you are not just driving a used car. You are the custodian of a philosophy that has gone extinct. You are driving a mechanical artifact built by men who believed that vibration was an insult to God, and that reliability was a moral obligation, not a marketing slogan. The reason we still see 30-year-old Accords running with 500,000 miles on them is not magic. It is the residue of a time when engineers ruled the boardroom and accountants were scared to speak up. But that time is gone forever, and it is never coming back. The new cars are computers on wheels, designed to be leased for 3 years and then recycled. But that old key in your pocket, that jagged piece of metal that starts a noisy, vibrating engine that refuses to quit, that is the true legacy. So the next time you turn that key and the engine catches life instantly, listen closely to the sound. It's not just a machine running. It is the heartbeat of Soichiro Honda echoing from the grave, reminding you that for a brief moment in history humans built things to last forever. And even though the company has changed, the metal doesn't lie. And the metal remembers everything. So keep it running. Keep it alive. Because when it's gone, we will be left with nothing but disposable plastic and the silence of a world that forgot how to build for eternity. And that is the secret they tried to hide. The immortality wasn't in the brand, it was in the fear of failure. And now that the fear is gone, only the survivors remain. Take care of them,